So, welcome everyone to today's Safe Policy lecture, which will be delivered by an esteemed colleague, Renee Adams. My name is Tobias Troeger. I'm your host today. And I'm truly thankful that Renee joins us today because the topics that she will discuss is really something that she is uniquely qualified to talk about, because Renee has been in her scholarship always been very interested in the inner mechanics and the working of board decision making and in general about how human traits, individual characteristics influence decision making in both boardrooms but also in investment decisions. And therefore, her talk today about women in the shareholder and stakeholder debate connects to extremely interesting topical aspects of the corporate governance debate, which is, on the one hand, of course, how does gender diversity benefit or somehow harm corporate governance? And on the other hand, of course, the larger debate on corporate purpose. Renee is, as I said, uniquely qualified, but she's also an excellent scholar who has done a lot of things in her life. She started out as a mathematician, but then received a PhD from the University of Chicago, before she went on a world tour, which brought her first to the New York Fed, and then after that also to Australia. And we're extremely thankful and happy that she now made her way back to Europe. For that purpose, the United Kingdom is still Europe geographically, and but also academically, of course. And she's now affiliated with the Saïd Business School at the University of Oxford. And as I said, today's topic is one of those that she can uniquely qualify, in a unique qualified way talk about. So it's not that she's only someone who jumped on the bandwagon. It's really that this is at the core of what she does. And therefore, I'm extremely thankful that you join us today, Renee. And immediately over to you. I'm looking forward to your talk.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Tobias, for this, for the invitation to talk about something that's very dear to my heart. So thanks everyone for attending this talk. And again, thanks to SAFE for inviting me. So I'm going to be talking about women in the shareholder stakeholder debate. And basically what's interesting about this topic, well, there's two sort of concurrent trends that are happening right now that are pretty important and potentially interlinked. And so the question is, are they linked? And if so, how? And should they be linked? So there's many interesting questions here. So the first trend is the increase in boardroom gender diversity. So what I have here is a plot from the European Institute for Gender Equality. They have data that they've been collecting for several years now on women's representation on corporate boards. And so this is across the EU. And so basically what this plot shows is the percent of women on boards. So for each firm, you calculate, what percent of the board is female, and then you average across the firms in the sample. And what do we see here? The trend is obviously increasing, right? So a lot of discussion about women's representation on boards, a lot of policy making in this area. The second trend is the current discussion about corporate purpose, CSR. So here I've copied, this is just a figure from a post on the Harvard Corporate Governance Forum for trends in 2020 in terms of corporate governance. So greater focus on the E and S of ESG, that's the #1 trend. Increasing importance of corporate purpose, the #2 trend, and better board oversight of corporate culture, #3 trend. Okay, so two trends that are going on, very important, and with potential many consequences. And so an obvious question is, are the two trends linked? And in particular, many people have argued for quite a while that women might be more stakeholder oriented. So, it's possible that, well, if there's an increase in board diversity, maybe we don't actually need to worry about corporate purpose and whether corporations are actually doing enough for stakeholders, because, having more gender diversity might actually solve the stakeholder problem, right? And so, so that's an important question. And so here I've copied a question, a statement from Catalyst So Catalyst wrote in 2011 that more women leaders means higher levels of corporate social responsibility. Okay, and so my question is this true, right? So is the diversity trend solving the corporate purpose trend? So now first, in order to understand whether it could be true, we have to understand what the argument is. Okay, and so the argument is very simple. Caring about stakeholders is basically caring about others, right? So you care about the broader society, you might care about the environment, you care about the firm's impact on external stakeholders, you care about how workers are being treated. So it's caring about others. And when it comes to caring about others, well, typically people think that women are more caring than men. Okay, so if women care more about others, then women might also be more stakeholder oriented. So that's the basic argument. Now to frame the discussion and the evidence I'm going to show you, I'm going to talk about, well, how might one go about actually trying to examine this issue? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, let's actually measure whether or not women are more other regarding than men. And how does one measure it? Well, there's a framework that is quite useful in this setting. I'm going to look at personal values. So there's a value system, the Schwarz value system. And basically, in the Schwarz value system, human values can be divided into 10 different values. And I've written down what these values are over here. They're typically represented in this sort of circular framework. So the values are power, security, tradition, conformity, benevolence, universalism, etc. So here you see the names of the values. And these can be broadly divided into different groups. So there are self-transcendence values of universalism and benevolence. Universalism is basically how much do you care about the broader society. And so these are the self-transcendence values, and there's also self-enhancement values, which is how much do you care about yourself, for example. And so there's a specific way that one can measure these values using surveys. And I actually have data on human values for directors. And so I'm going to show you what we can infer from this data using the Schwarz human value system. Okay, so so back to this argument. So is increasing board diversity the solution to the stakeholder problem? So if women are more other regarding, that might actually be the case. Now, are women more other regarding? People say that they are, but let me actually show you some evidence. And here I have some evidence for the general population. Okay, so now I'm not looking at directors. I'm just saying, well, on average, what does the evidence say? And so this evidence comes from the World Values Survey, which is a very long-standing survey of the general population across many countries. And here I haven't broken down by country or anything. I'm just saying in the overall data, what does the evidence say? And in terms of other regarding preferences or values, I'm looking at universalism here. So universalism is how much you care about broader society. So here I have this bar chart, and basically here's average universalism for women, and here's average universalism for men. Here's 0. Okay, so both of these are positive. So both men and women care about broader society on average, right? So that's good news, of course. But you see that the bar for the women is slightly more to the right. So on average, it is indeed, there's substantial evidence that women care more about broader society than men. Okay, so that would suggest that women are then also more stakeholder oriented, right? So I guess there are a couple questions before we can, conclude that women might be more stakeholder oriented from this sort of population data. And the questions that I'm going to address are, so first, can we generalize from the population to the boardroom? Second, is being other regarding sufficient to favor stakeholders over shareholders? And then third, can we generalize across institutional environments? So those are the 3 questions I'm going to try and answer or provide some evidence on. Okay, and to do this, I'm going to use some data on directors. that I collected with my co-author Amir Licht. So we did a survey of directors across many countries in 2011. This was an original language survey, and we have data from 23 countries. So we have roughly 1,000 respondents. As you can imagine, it's not so easy to do a survey of directors of large listed companies and get a very high response rate. So our response rate is not fantastic, but it's not too bad compared to other surveys in the literature, in the leadership space. And in our survey, the key things that we looked at is, or we tried to measure, are attitudes of directors towards stakeholders and shareholders. So this is a really important aspect of the study that also I'm going to show you, I'm going to bring to bear on this question today. And so how does one measure attitudes towards stakeholders and shareholders? So what we did is we said, well, the only time this question of corporate purpose is really relevant, the only time it's really interesting is when there's an actual conflict between shareholders and stakeholders, right? So, so on many things, shareholders and stakeholders will agree. It's only when they disagree, that's where, we have to have a discussion, like how should the corporation decide, right? And so we basically constructed scenarios where there's an actual conflict between shareholders and stakeholders. And to do that, we used very sort of seminal court cases where shareholders were on one side and stakeholders on the other side, because these court cases represented sort of clear situations of conflicts of interest. So we confronted directors with sort of these scenarios derived from court cases and asked them how they would have decided if they had been a director in those situations. So from these responses, we constructed directors' attitudes towards stakeholders and shareholders. We also measure their personal values using the Schwarz value system, and we have personal characteristics. So the key characteristic that I'm going to talk about today is gender. Now, so I have this data on directors, and I also have data, as I showed you before, from the population, from the World Values Survey. I'm going to use the 2015 World Values Survey here, but one can also use other data. And so what's interesting there is I have the personal values also using the Schwarz value system, and I have personal characteristics for the general population, so in particular gender. Okay, so I'm going to use this data to try to provide some answers or take a step towards providing answers. I think this is an ongoing question that requires a lot more research that I'm going to be able to bring to bear on this topic in the short time. But the first question is, so can we generalize from the population to the boardroom? Right, so I already showed you the World Values Survey data that suggested that women are more universalist than men on average in the population. Now, it turns out that we can't generalize from the population to the boardroom. Okay, so what I'm showing you here is I'm showing you the difference between women's universalism and men's universalism. On the left, for the general population, so this is basically the same as I showed you before. This is the World Value Surveys data. So this is the general population, and this right here on the right is for the boardroom. Okay, so these are the directors who answered our survey. Okay, so in the population, women are more universalist than men. In the boardroom, so here's 0, right? So this is to the left of 0, this is negative, and this is the difference. So the average value for women minus the average value for men. Okay, so that means, sorry, I misspoke here. This is female directors versus other women. Sorry. So this right here is the gender gap in values for the World Values Survey. So it's women minus men. And on the right, we have female directors as compared to women in the population. Okay, so hopefully I didn't completely confuse you. Let me say that again. Women minus men on the left, and female directors minus women in the population on the right. Okay, so what does this tell you? So in the population, women are more universalist than men, right? Now, if we look at women in the boardroom, So that basically says that, well, in general, women are more universalist, right? But then women in the boardroom are significantly less universalist than women in the population. Okay. So we think that, oh, women care about broader society. On average, that's true. But then when we get to the boardroom, the picture is slightly different. Okay. Now, so what's happening here? There's selection going on. Okay, so the women who are on boards are not the same as the women in the population. Now, of course, it's important to realize that there's also selection going on for men, right? So men on boards are also not the same as in the population. Okay, so what I'm going to show you here is, so I have the same graph from the previous slide. So female directors versus other women. So it's the difference between the average value for the female directors versus the average value for women in the population. It's to the left of 0. This is negative. So female directors are less universalist than the women in the population. Same graph for the men. So this is male directors versus other men. It's also to the left of 0. So male directors are less universalist than the average man in the population. So basically, when it comes to the boardroom, generally speaking, directors look as if they are less other regarding than typical members of the population. And this is true for both men and for women. Okay, so, but then this raises a question, right? So if all directors look less other regarding than people in the population, what is the gender difference in the boardroom? And so this is what I'm illustrating in this graph right here. So here I have the gender gap in the population. It's positive. So women in the population are more universalist than men. Here I have the difference between female directors and women in the population. Here's the difference between male directors and men in the population. And then here we get to the boardroom. So this is a consequence of the selection process. This is the gender difference. So again, average value for female directors minus average value for male directors in the boardroom. And so what does it say? It says that women are less universalist in the boardroom. And why might they be less universalist in the boardroom? Well, because to become a director as a woman, you can't be the typical woman in the population, right? So there's a selection process that happens. And as a consequence of the selection, your preferences may be different from the typical preferences. Okay, now I want to point out, however, so it looks like, well, the women are less universalist, but actually this difference in the boardroom is not statistically significant. Okay, so basically women and men in the boardroom in this sample are not different in terms of their other regarding preferences. In the population, this difference is significant, and directors are very different from the population, so these differences are also significant. Okay, but once they reach the boardroom, there's no difference between women and men in their other regarding preferences. Okay, so you know, basically, can we generalize? I would argue, no, we can't, right? There may be situations in which one could generalize, but one has to understand when one can generalize and when one cannot. Okay, so second question, is being other regarding sufficient to favor stakeholders over shareholders? And so my co-author Amir and another co-author Lila Sagiv and we wrote a paper on this topic that was published in 2011. And in that paper, we argued that, yes, it's true that if you are more other regarding, you might favor stakeholders relatively more than shareholders. But there are also other values that might lead you to be relatively less pro-stakeholder. And in particular, we thought that, or we hypothesized that the more directors hold entrepreneurial values, the more likely they would favor with shareholders or be on the side of shareholders. Now, what are entrepreneurial values? Entrepreneurial values are power orientation, achievement orientation, and self-direction. And so our hypothesis was that the more directors emphasize those values, the more they would be pro-shareholder as opposed to pro-stakeholder. Okay, so now let me show you what happens for power. So now I'm going to look, before I showed you the evidence for universalism, which is how other regarding directors are, and I showed you that women and men don't differ in their universalism in the boardroom, even though they differ in the population. Now let me show you what happens with power, exactly the same sort of setup. So here I'm comparing power for women and men in the population. This is to the left of 0. So in general, in the population, women are less power-oriented than men. Here I compare female directors to women in the population. So here we have 0. This is to the right of 0. So female directors are significantly more power-oriented than the typical woman in the population. Not surprising, right? Because to be a director, you presumably have to have some power orientation. The same goes for men. So men who are in the boardroom are significantly more power oriented than the typical man in the population. Okay, so what's the gender difference in the boardroom? So here it's average power for women minus average power for men. It's to the right of 0. So women in the boardroom are more power-oriented than men in the boardroom. Okay, so we go again from a population difference to a population gender gap that says, well, women are less power-oriented, to the opposite gender gap in the boardroom, just like with universalism. Okay, so the gender gaps flip in the boardroom as a result of selection. Okay, so basically the argument is that women are, so the more universalist a director is, our theory says the relatively less directors should care about shareholders as opposed to stakeholders. But the more power-oriented they are, the more they should care about shareholders. So in our sample, women are no different from men in their other regarding preferences, but they're more power-oriented than men. And as a result, it's not surprising that their shareholderism, which is the measure of attitudes that we developed towards shareholders as opposed to stakeholders, the gender difference is positive, right? So women in our sample are relatively more pro-shareholder as opposed to pro-stakeholder. Okay, so what's the point? It's not obvious necessarily that gender is related to stakeholder orientation, right? Now, can we generalize across institutional environments? Well, I actually have a previous paper that I wrote with Amira and Lilla. In this previous paper, we surveyed directors in Sweden, and the findings from Sweden were actually quite different. And so the fact that they were different suggests that the answer to the question, can we generalize, is obviously going to be no. Okay, so let me show you what we found in that paper. So we surveyed directors in Sweden. They're directors of listed companies, and we did the same thing. We compared women and men in their preferences as measured by these human values. And so what I have here is the average difference between women and men in achievement, power, self-direction, universalism, and down here I have shareholderism. Okay, now here's 0. Okay, so if the bar is to the right of 0, that means women emphasize it more. If it's to the left, it means men emphasize it more. So men are slightly more achievement oriented. They're more power oriented. Note this is the opposite of the other sample. Women are more self-directed and women are more universalist. So in this sample from Sweden, this difference is significant. So women do differ from men in terms of their other regarding preferences. And in this sample also, so you see women are much more universalist, they're less power oriented. And so as a result, they're relatively more pro-stakeholder as opposed to being pro-shareholder in this particular sample. Okay, so two different samples, two different results. What does this tell you? It tells you that institutional environment matters. Okay, so let me just highlight this by showing you gender differences in shareholder orientation in the cross-country sample. Okay, so here basically I told you that the average effect is positive. So women on average are more pro-shareholder in this sample. Now I'm breaking it down by country. Okay, so here are the gender differences by country. And here what you see is in Australia, the women in our sample, the female directors in our sample, are more pro-shareholder than the men. In Canada, it's the opposite. The women are more pro-stakeholder than the men. In Germany, the women are slightly more pro-shareholder than the men, but you see there's a difference to Australia. The magnitude of the gender difference is smaller. In India and Ireland, women are more pro-stakeholder. In Israel, the difference is negligible. Here again, the women are more pro-shareholder. Spain, the women are definitely more pro-stakeholder. And then here at the bottom, Switzerland, United Kingdom, and United States, the women are more pro-shareholder. Okay, so what does this tell you? It tells you that there's variation across country. Okay, now that raises a question, why is there variation across countries, right? So why is there no simple answer? Are women more pro-stakeholder? Telling you, actually, I don't know, right? There's variation in the data. Okay, so what's the point here? The point is that the institutional environment can select, obviously, or can be a key factor in shaping who sits on the board, right? So first of all, values can vary across countries. So universalism, other regarding preferences may be very different in one country than in another country. Okay, so even stakeholder orientation could be different for directors on boards in those countries. Selection can also vary across country, like who sits on the board, how directors reach their board seats may be very different across countries. And selection can also vary over time. You know, so there's a lot of policy making in the gender space in particular. And so could it be the case that the woman who's on the board because of a quota has very different, sort of a very different value profile than a woman who's on the board in a country that doesn't have a board diversity quota? And the answer is yes, of course. So the values could look quite different. Okay, so back to my questions. So can we generalize from the population to the boardroom? The answer is no. Is being other regarding sufficient to favor stakeholders over shareholders? The answer is also no. Can we generalize across institutional environments? And the answer is no. Is it true that more women leaders means higher levels of corporate social responsibility? And the answer is no, right? And so when I say no, of course, I'm trying to make a point here. It doesn't mean that it can't lead to higher corporate social responsibility. My point is that we don't know whether on average, having more female leaders leads to more corporate social responsibility. And more generally, I would like to make the case that we don't even really have a good understanding of differences between men and women. You know, so if we look at the population, does that tell us how women and men might think or behave in particular situations? Not necessarily. And do we understand selection? I would argue no. Why are the boards different or have different preferences in one country versus the other? I think we're just at the very beginning of trying to understand this. So some concluding thoughts. So I would argue that equating gender with CSR is actually stereotyping. So what you do when you say, well, more women increases in board gender diversity will lead to increases in corporate social responsibility, you're basically saying, well, because women on average might be more other regarding, that generalizes to every situation. So I would say that that's stereotyping. Is that okay to do? Because this might be a positive for women, right? So women might receive board seats because people think that having sort of other regarding preferences is desirable. While I would, I question whether the same tools that might have been used to discriminate against women should be used for reverse discrimination. And I should also point out that, making generalizations like, oh, women are generally more other regarding, and therefore we know that, or we think that they will be more stakeholder friendly, that's also stereotyping men, right? So there's a lot of stereotyping in this discussion, and one has to be aware of it. And so, is this bad news for women? So if women do not necessarily improve CSR, does this mean we should not appoint women to the board? And my answer is no. And basically my take on this is that the two debates should be separated, right? The discussion about, should we have women on boards? Should we aim for more gender equality is an entirely different discussion. And this is really a discussion about human rights, right? So gender equality is a human rights issue. If you view it from that perspective, then women do not need and should not need to justify their place at the table, right? So women should be able to be directors irrespective of whether they care more or less about stakeholders, and irrespective of whether their presence might lead to higher firm performance, as some argue. So I view these two issues as completely separate. And just to conclude, this discussion about, should we have directors who have more sort of stakeholder preferences or fewer stakeholder preferences? Do we need to, is this gender difference going to make a big difference? Suppose that in some countries, women really are more stakeholder oriented than in other countries, or directors with other types of characteristics are seen as being more stakeholder oriented. Should we now change our nomination processes? So there's many questions that might arise. And I thought, it's just useful to get some perspective on this issue. So how do directors really think about the shareholder stakeholder discussion? So our data tells us a little bit about this. And what I have here is I've plotted the histogram of our shareholderism measure. And so basically the way it's plotted, so the shareholderism measure in our sample, which measures, the tension between shareholders and stakeholders, it varies between 1 and 6, where 6 is the maximum. And if you answer 6, you're pro-shareholder, very much pro-shareholder. And if you answer 1, you're pro-stakeholder. You're always on the side of stakeholders. And basically what you see here, so this is, these are responses from directors across many countries. And what you see here is directors really, most of the mass is in the middle, right? So it's really not the case that directors are only pro-shareholder or only pro-stakeholder. In general, directors are really on the middle. So directors have nuanced attitudes towards this question, which also suggests that, there's probably no simple fix if one wants to change their minds or direct them towards certain outcomes. There's probably no simple fix, but it also raises questions about, well, what fixes are necessary? So if we think that directors are not doing the best for stakeholders, is it the directors, or is there something about the institutional environment that is causing them to maybe make decisions that don't seem to be in the interest of stakeholders, or that don't seem to be desirable? So I just like to conclude on that point and say that, there's much more research that needs to be done in this area. And what I think is really important is that one doesn't jump too quickly to conclusions and basically reserves judgment until one sees the evidence. And hopefully it's clear that one shouldn't generalize too quickly from the population or assumptions about, especially in the area of gender, about how directors might think on particular issues. So that's all I have. I have a bunch of references if anyone's interested, and I look forward to further questions. Thanks.
Yes, thanks, Renée. Thanks very much. That was extremely insightful and really full of thought-provoking data. For those who are not familiar with the way that we conduct the discussion now, the Q&A, there is a Q&A function in Zoom at the bottom of your page, and you can type in your questions, and I'm going to somehow moderate, and Renée is going to look at them too. So if I do something wrong, she can correct me and also answer questions that I might overlook. So I think the first question that is more something that is a question of how we have to understand this. Schwarz metric comes from Christine Laubenbach, and she's asking whether these general values are persistent over time, and whether these values are independent. So you can score high, for example, on other regarding values, but also high on power preferences and something like that. Maybe you can enlighten us on that a little bit.
Yeah, so it is, you can in principle, well, maybe, well, now I took down the slides, but if you remember the circular description of the values, so you're probably more likely to score, if you score highly in one area of the values, like you score highly on self-transcendence, you might also score highly on related, values that are relatively close, but not necessarily. Okay, so if you notice, so in our sample, in the Swedish sample, for example, women scored very highly on self-direction and universalism. Now, would one expect that? Not necessarily, right? That those two would be moving together. You might say, well, they score highly on universalism, so therefore they score low on power, and that's possible. But again, these can't be predicted sort of deterministically ex ante.
Then there is a related question, or from Guido Friedel, but I'm gonna move one question further up the ladder, which comes from Olivia Mitchell, and she's asking whether the distinction that is at the heart of your research between shareholders and stakeholders is not artificial, because she says that shareholders are also stakeholders, and that of course comes to more recent debates on corporate purpose and shareholder preferences. So maybe you can just expand a little bit on that very fundamental question, which is of course quite important.
Yeah. So and honestly, I would say that nobody has a good answer to this question, right? So I'm not going to claim that we measure this perfectly. So basically, I think this is a really difficult question, and I think this whole corporate purpose discussion, hasn't defined exactly what it means, and maybe because you can't define exactly what it means to be in the interests of shareholders versus stakeholders, right? I think this is a really difficult question because of course shareholders are also stakeholders. But so what we did when we tried to measure this is we said, we tried to get at this issue by saying, look, the only time this discussion is interesting is when the interests of the two parties conflict, right? Because if they don't conflict, then everyone is a stakeholder. The shareholders are stakeholders and the stakeholders are stakeholders, right? Because everyone agrees. Okay. But there may be situations in which the two parties will have conflicting interests. And when I say, what are the two parties? Well, then it really is the equity, like the people who hold the shares versus the employees or the community or the creditors. Okay, so those are the things that we looked at. And so we tried to measure this conflict. And yeah, and so our measure does capture this sort of trade-off between, the holders of the shares and other stakeholders. But it's not necessarily, the only potential way of thinking about these issues, right? And, so I think that's a good question, but I really think, like, as I said, there's much more research that needs to be done in this area, and also much more sort of conceptualization of these issues.
And maybe one follow-up from my side on exactly that. So much of the corporate governance debate is essentially about that directors don't care much about either stakeholders or shareholders. They care about themselves. So how does that, finding about the fundamental principal agent conflict really influence the findings, and how should we treat them with some a grain of salt or something like that? Because of course it's again a survey, but do you also think that what you see there translates into actual corporate behavior, or is that just something that you do in a survey?
Okay, now you have many questions in that question, right? So, okay, the second one first. Do the survey questions transfer into corporate behavior? So that, of course, is a really important question. I can make no claims as to whether whether what we measure would actually map into corporate outcomes. But the way I view our evidence is that it raises important questions. It doesn't provide answers in some sense, right? So I really advocate for people asking more questions and questioning fundamental assumptions. And I think our evidence can do that. Our evidence can say, well, look, it's not that obvious, right? Because if these preferences don't map into corporate outcomes, then an obvious question is why? Why don't they map into corporate outcomes? And I don't have the answer, but I think we should do more research on this, right? I would also say that a lot of the literature makes assumptions about director preferences that they say map into corporate outcomes, but a lot of these assumptions, I think if one picked them apart, one could raise many questions about them, right? So if these are not good measures of directors' sort of preferences, what is a good measure, right? Now the question about, well, directors only care about themselves. Well, I think that's probably, I guess everybody cares about themselves, right? So I guess one could also argue that all the people who complain about the stakeholders and, shareholders and whatever, they also care about themselves, right? So do directors care relatively more about themselves than other people? I think is an interesting question for, also more research. I don't think we know this. I think there's a presumption in the literature that directors basically can do no right. And actually what I think is really sort of ironic about this whole discussion about stakeholders is we used to argue that directors were evil because they weren't maximizing shareholder value. And now we're arguing they're evil because they're maximizing shareholder value. Right. So it's like, no matter what, the benchmark is always moving. Right. And so I think we need to be aware of that fact. Again, I think, our evidence raises questions that are interesting to examine. That histogram I showed you showed that directors tend to be in the middle. Right. So they're not totally pro-stakeholder. They're not totally pro-shareholder. That suggests that maybe they do sort of care about stakeholders. And not just themselves, but since we didn't measure if they care about themselves, I guess it would be hard to say exactly.
Okay, very well. There are some questions that point into the same direction, and I'm just going to group them together, which revolve around the influence of culture as such. And first, of course, does that maybe explain the variation across countries and regions? And the second one is a little bit more intricate, comes from Andreas Neuber, who's asking whether the culture on the corporate level, so the corporate culture somehow has an effect on the selection and the nomination process. And I don't know if you have any ideas on these two questions, particularly the second one is, of course, very, very intricate, but yes.
Yeah, so does culture matter? I would say probably definitely, right? So basically, Amir and I, we did a paper looking at directors in general and how their shareholderism attitudes varied across countries. And basically what we found is the same argument that I make for the individual preferences. So if you have other regarding values as an individual, we argue that you're more stakeholder oriented, right? So we made that argument. You can make the same argument for culture. So if you're a director in a culture that is more other regarding, then you might generally be more stakeholder oriented. And so we found evidence consistent with that. So we found that personal values matter and culture matters. Okay, so now this was for directors in general. We didn't look at the gender difference. So the gender difference, like literally, I've just been analyzing it very recently. So I don't know yet what are the factors that relate to variation in gender gaps across countries. But I assume that it's going to be things like culture and potential barriers to women reaching the boardroom, right? So it's not hard to imagine that in countries where women have a harder time getting into the boardroom, that the selection effect will be much bigger, right? And it could be both selection from the women's side, very different women will pursue a board position, but it could also be selection from the board side, right? So boards might only choose certain women to be on the board, which sort of gets into the second point about selection processes. So, you know, it's sort of one of my quibbles with the board literature is very little attention is paid to actual nomination processes and selection processes for directors. And I think that is actually a fundamental issue that we have to try and understand. So how directors get into the boardroom should be really important. If we care who these people are, we should care how they're selected. But I don't know, there's not enough evidence, I think, so we haven't looked at it yet. Again, I think we are just raising questions that would be interesting to pursue.
Now that Guido Friebel is already giving me a pummeling here, I didn't overgo your question, Guido. It's just that I wanted to group it together with another question because there are other questions which pertain to the relevance of children. So essentially, did you control for whether board members had children? Because that certainly might be a strong influence on how people actually think about these things. And that also might indicate how things change over time, right? So whether a strong favor for a career, for example, which does not go together with founding a family or something like that, influences these things. So these are questions regarding the relevance of children that you control for that.
Yeah, so in the international survey, we don't have data on whether directors have children. So of course, it will be interesting to look at whether sort of national policies related to maternity leave or something might be correlated with gender gaps. So I haven't done that yet, but that's definitely something that I would like to do. Now, in Sweden, I do have data on the children. And what was quite noticeable in the Swedish data is that the female directors had fewer kids than the male directors. Okay, so that already tells you something, right? And then what we did for the Swedish sample, because we got a lot of pushback on the data from Sweden, because people were like, well, does this generalize? And also, you can imagine, you do a survey, which number one is already like, people question surveys all the time. And then you do a survey in Sweden. So why should we care about it? And so what we did is we did a little exercise where we said, well, do we expect the results to generalize to other countries? And we compared female directors in Sweden to female directors in the US on the number of children. So we got some data on number of children from the Who's Who's directories for the US directors. And we found that women so female directors in the US had even fewer children than the female directors in Sweden. So the hierarchy was male directors have kids, male directors in Sweden have kids, female directors in Sweden have fewer kids, and female directors in the US have even fewer kids. So I think this speaks to the selection, well, it definitely speaks to the selection in many ways that I think are really interesting and really deserving of more attention.
Yeah, obviously. Related question also with regard to essentially selection processes and culture. Do you see any correlation between the total number of women on boards and the preferences that you see? I think that points into the direction whether if you have a culture which is more hostile towards women on board, you might see other women on board with other preferences. I don't know if you have any evidence on that.
Yeah, not yet. So that's obviously something interesting to explore, right? So, and there's many interesting issues there, right? Because, so first, is the country generally more, is it easier for women to reach the board in some countries versus others? That's an interesting question. And then also, what's the role of policy, right? Because policies change the equilibrium. And it's pretty clear that this increase in board gender diversity that I showed you at the beginning, a lot of that is driven by board gender policies. And then if you have a board gender policy, of course, the question is, are you drawing people from a different distribution of preferences than you would normally draw them, right? So, so I think this will be interesting to explore. I'm not going to promise that we can do too much with survey data where, like we have 1,000 observations across countries and not all of those are female, right? So, so there's only so far one can push the data, but I think, again, we'll be able to raise some interesting questions that I think will point to things that would be interesting to examine and further research.
So very good. One tiny question while people are thinking about more questions that they might want to ask you. One tiny question from my side. There's this difference between one-tier and two-tier systems. So particularly that, just the German experience is that, of course, a lot of women that you see on the supervisory board in the two-tier systems are nominated by the trade unions. And therefore, a stakeholder orientation is not very surprising. And I don't know if you also looked into that, or if you intend to control for that, because I think that whenever more granular to the selection process, right? So whenever I think certain, by definition, stakeholder-oriented organizations are somehow institutionally involved in the selection process, I think that should be a driver in these findings.
Yeah, so I think that is something that we'll definitely have to look at, whether the preferences vary by one-tier and two-tier system, which anyhow is an interesting question, I think. But I can say, so in the Swedish data, we actually know who's an employee representative. And the findings are exactly what you would expect in the Swedish data. So the employee representatives are significantly more pro-stakeholder than the other directors, which I view as actually sort of, in some sense, validating our measure of shareholderism, because it lines up exactly with the way it should line up, that the employee representatives care relatively more about the stakeholders than the shareholders. So now it'd be interesting to see whether that generalizes, and it's sort of interesting. Unfortunately, we don't know who's an employee representative in the international sample. But what's interesting for Germany in particular is that the women are actually more shareholder oriented than the men on average. The difference is not large, but it doesn't go in the direction of the women being necessarily only the union representatives. So it could just be that the women who answered our survey just didn't happen to be the union representatives, or maybe, again, it's not so easy to generalize. So I'm not able to answer that.
That's perfectly fine. So I think we've more or less exploited the Q&A. But I think so. One key takeaway is there's a lot of research to be done in order to answer all these very important questions, and that is something that can also be done in Frankfurt, because Renée is a frequent visitor and also co-authoring with a lot of people from Frankfurt, and this is why we look very much forward to discussing these questions and others with you again, and hopefully find more opportunities in the future to also have your research presented to a wider audience, because as we obviously saw, that this is nothing from the ivory tower. This is highly relevant, and therefore we have to thank you wholeheartedly that, there are some more questions coming. No, there are not. Okay, so therefore I think this is really something that was extremely insightful, and we look forward to this. And
one last advertisement here. The paper that was at the heart of the presentation today is also a working paper that can be downloaded from the site of the Center for Advanced Studies of Law and Finance, because there Renée is also a fellow. And we look very much forward to future exchanges. And thank you very much. And now stay safe. Renée, bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much for inviting me. And thanks
A
everyone
pleasure,
for
as
their
always.
questions and attending.